Podcast. Ryan Ray alongside the good doctor herself, Dr. Ellen Wald. We were off last week. Apologies. Kids were out of school, and I realized I had a gazillion things to do with my son that I forgot about, and so we had to get all of that done. So good to be back, Dr. Wald. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good. I would just like to know for the record that this is a poppy, but it is not a poppy of the Remembrance Day for World War One
Oh,
types. I
okay,
realized today it looked a lot like that, and it's totally off season. So
okay.
just a
Um,
pretty pin.
Pretty pin. There we
Not
go.
not I have not mixed up the World War One Remembrance Day and President's Day. So.
All right, there we go. So I got a question from a listener. This is a few days back, but I said we'd take it on the podcast, and it's what is Russia to gain if it invaded Ukraine? Now we're recording this at 1 o'clock Central Time on Monday the 1st, and things are happening. So who knows by the time this comes out what could or couldn't happen? I'm still have some thoughts, but Dr. Wald, what's from your perspective the biggest advantage for the Russians to invade?
So what's okay?
What's the gain?
I'm gonna take us all the way back to George Kennan and his long telegram from like 1946, I think it was, or 47. Um, and George Kennan was a very astute observer of the kind of Russian mindset, and he basically wrote this very long telegram. It is really long. So it's a funny story. When I was in college, so he lived in Princeton, and they had a special exhibit in honor of like the 100th his 100th birthday or the 100th some sort of anniversary, and they actually got a copy of the original like long printout of the long telegram from the National Archives, and they put it in a display case, one page next to the other, and it was to show you how like long it actually was. So that was kind of cool. But anyway, one of the points that he argues in his long telegram is that even predating the Soviet Union, that Russia has had this kind of general like insecurity in terms of its foreign policy because it's so large, and basically it the only way that it feels it can achieve national security is to keep expanding. So that's why and so he goes on, and then he basically out it describes like the then how this works and whatnot, improves it, and then the policy implications of it are this like containment that comes out of it is this idea of containment, that you have to therefore contain Russia from expanding because they will always be trying to expand, because that's the only way that they feel they can have security, because they're in such a large landmass and they're so big, and they can't it's not like the US where like we've got the Atlantic on one side and the Pacific on the other. So yeah, I mean it like we feel pretty secure in our state. So I would say, I mean, I think this is like a generalized issue here. When Russia was doing all that stuff in Crimea in 2014, one of the big points to remember then was Russia was always lacking a warm water port.
Mhm.
And and having control in Crimea gave it access to a warm water port in the Black Sea. So you could argue that maybe they want to like secure this, but I think part of this is Russia sees security in expanding its sphere of influence. And I think that's what we're seeing right now with Putin. I think the very latest thing that he has said is like Eastern Ukraine is like considered like Russian territory.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so there's just this kind of innate need to expand, and that expansion of Russian kind of influence is how they fulfill their national desire for like national security. That's kind of my read from a very foreign policy take. I'm sure there are like more immediate, short term things. A good person to answer that question would also be Jeremy Friedman, because he has a really good
Oh
kind of
yeah.
sense of both Russian interest, but also Ukraine. I believe he also speaks Ukrainian, so
Oh wow.
maybe we'll get him on here to discuss.
Yeah, we should get him on to discuss it. So I think so. I agree with what you say, but I also think you got to kind of start at what's the gain depends on what's at stake for them to lose, right? And I
Yeah.
think that if I still don't think I'm still they're not going to invade, but we'll see. They have to suspect that they can invade if they do invade that they can invade now at a lesser price than it would have cost them 5 years, 10 years, 20 years ago. Because all the points that you're making, which I agree with, didn't just come up today, right? And so, what's to gain is that they think that now is a better time than it was prior to that.
That's a good point. I mean, there's definitely been okay, so what's to gain? I mean, I think that there's definitely like less of a concern, I think, now that Trump is not the president. I think that Putin had there was definitely I know that the like common idea is that like, oh, Trump's friends with Putin, so he'll do what he wants. I think that like actually like Putin was like, oh my god, this guy is like a little unhinged. Like who knows what he'll do? Whereas, it's pretty clear what Biden will and will not do.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that to your point that there's that. The other thing you mentioned is the East Ukrainian groups that are some of them are claiming that they want Moscow to take it as well. So I think that's something we talked about before is that this border between the Russians and the Ukrainians isn't exactly like. And I have a guest that's going to come on Inside the War in a few months. They're going to talk about the U.S. Mexico border and how it's basically its own little nation, if you will, because people there kind of think about the border differently than people in Maine would, or East Texas, or Oklahoma would. And so it would surprise me to see that if you did see some of these Eastern Ukrainians along the border want to side with the Russians either. But I don't know. Are you still thinking they're not going to invade, or have you think we're gonna see it?
Um, it's so weird because you've got there's so much conflicting stuff going on, and I have a really hard time like taking anything from say like Sputnik News correctly. But even still, like there was some guy from like MSNBC saying like, oh, they're definitely I have a good authority. They're definitely going to invade, and it's going to be really really violent and like like you read something like that and you're like, okay, but then the like official word was like Macron is going to get the two of them. They agreed in principle or whatever to like meet with each other. I mean, I don't think like that the timing is particularly right for some sort of like grand invasion like and also like when you have people like Kamala Harris coming out and saying like we're closer to war than we've ever been since World War II. Like, did they forget the Balkans? Like, I'm sorry, but like, this is like there has been war in Europe since World War II.
Yeah.
Like, there was a huge conflict in the Balkans, and there were a lot of NATO troops in there. Like, do we just forget about that?
Right.
Apparently we did.
Yeah.
Apparently they don't matter in the rhetoric or whatever. So that like just makes me not take any of that very seriously. I think it's chances. I mean, I think that it's much more likely that they'll just like give some weapons and support to their like separatist guys,
Right.
and they're
Well,
going to declare part of Ukraine Russia, but
right.
not actually cross the border. And like Russia will have different maps from everyone else.
Well, that's the thing. That's what makes it interesting because these two breakaway regions in East Ukraine, if they say that they're Russians and the Russians say that they're Russians, I don't know Ukrainian or international law or any of that, but are they then Russians? And so how do you if the Russians then go into that territory? Is it actually you see what you're saying?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, look, that's how like World War I almost like started because part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So there was Serbia was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and there were people in Serbia who were these like Slavic separatists who were like, no, we're Eastern Slavs and we're part of Russia and we want to be. They wanted more like to be separate, but Russia was all like, yeah, we're also Slavs. Like Slavs stick with Slavs, and we're gonna defend the Serbian separatists. And that's like part of how the whole like World War I started. So it's not like, I mean, if Ukraine was like, okay, let's have a referendum, and if they want to break away, that's cool with us, then, you know, I think that you'd have to respect the process. But I don't think Ukraine's going to be like, let's hold a referendum and see if half of like, or part of our like country wants to go and like join the Russian Empire or form a new country. Unless Ukraine is up for that, which I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
see. So then I don't see that you can like, yeah, you have like otherwise, unless there's some sort of democratic process that everyone agrees on, the other step is military.
okay. All right.
That's
That's our take on the Russia-Ukrainian conflict. I'm sure, I know there will be something between now and next Monday that we will have to chat about. So, okay. Let's see here from SP Global Platts. Crude oil futures slip after opening surge as risk appetite wanes. And to be clear, the futures, I don't know the future, the current price rather, is WTI is sitting at 93. Brent crude is sitting at 96. We are
so.
seeing some pricey oil after
Yeah.
all.
So what do you think? What's everyone wants? Like everyone's like, oh, there's such a risk premium on it. So what do you think if, say, this whole thing in Russia Ukraine wasn't going on? What do you think the price would be?
Let me see here. Let me pull up the past 2 months pricing. Months pricing. So a month ago we were sitting at 83.31 a month ago today. So we're thinking that $10 is baked into the price right now. I mean, and this isn't counting the inflation. So yeah, I don't. I think it is a little high, but I'm not sure where. I'm not sure is 83 the right number? Probably, but I don't have a strong opinion on that. What's your take?
Yeah, I think there's at least like a $7 to $10 risk premium right now. But the problem is it's not just a risk premium from like military action or war or whatever. It's like these freaking sanctions that nobody actually knows what they're going to be. And every time someone's like, "Oh, I will provide more clarity about the sanctions," and then they don't. Like that woman who's like the head of the EU, what's her name? Ursula, whatever her name
Hmm.
is. She's like, I think it was like yesterday. I tweeted about it. I'm going to find the tweet because I think it's interesting. She said something like it was like, let's provide, like, I'm providing more information, and then she just didn't at all. She said, yeah, okay. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen disclosed some details of the sanctions Moscow would face if it invaded Ukraine, saying Russia would be cut off from international financial markets and denied access to major export goods. That's not like much in terms of disclosure. Like, does that mean they're going to cut Russia off from SWIFT or not? Because they talked about it and then they were like, no, we're definitely not doing that. But cutting them off from international financial systems might indicate that they are doing that, or are they just going to like sanction some Russian banks and call it a day? Plus, like, cut them off from major exports. So are they going to cut off Russian exports, or are they going to cut off things that we export to Russia?
Yeah, I don't think they have a cohesive plan of what
So
exactly.
like,
Did you see the Kamala Harris quote today on the sanctions?
oh God, no, I did not. After her whole like hyperbole about this being like the first war in Europe since World War II, I was too angry to listen to anything else she had to say.
Let's see here. I'll try to pull it up real quick. It was it was insightful stuff. Um, but the Russians have also said that they're prepared to deal with the sanctions as well. So I don't know if there's really
Well, I think they're definitely. I think they've, and I said this, that they will export more oil and gas to China. I think they're absolutely prepared to do that. And yeah, it might take like a little bit of time, but I think that they are much better prepared to reorient their oil and gas exports to China than Europe or the US is prepared to reorient its imports away from Russia. if that makes sense. So, like, what I think will happen is China will buy more from Russia, especially because Russia is willing to accept payment in yuan and all that kind of stuff. And you'll see, like, the Arab states probably sending more to Europe, but at a markup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hold
That's
on.
what I think.
I got the Kamala Harris quote right here. Hold on. It is. Who tweets a ton? It was a gem too. Where's it at? Yeah. Okay. Here it goes. Reporter: Should Americans be braced? Vice President Harris: Would America stand? Oh, no. That's the wrong one. Hold on. Let me get it. It's right here. We found it though. Yeah. Will sanctions deter Putin? Vice President Harris. Within the context then of the fact that the window is still opening, although it is absolutely narrowing, but within the context of a diplomatic path still being open.
It's not like a word salad. Is there a screen on the window?
I don't even
Are there
know.
like bars on the window? What kind of window is it?
I don't even
Is
know
there
what that
double
means.
paned?
Like
Have
we
we
make fun of
washed the
Trump. Like
windows?
that's
Let's send in the
that's
window washer.
yeah. I mean, and listen, this is yeah. I mean, that's yeah. I mean, you can read the full quote. It's absolute. We strongly believe, and remember also that the sanctions are a product not only of our perspective as the United States, but as a shared perspective among our allies. An allied relationship is such that we have agreed that the deterrence effect of these sanctions is still a meaningful one, especially because, remember, also, we sincerely hope that there's a diplomatic path out of this moment. And within the context then of the fact that the window is still opening, although open, although it is absolutely narrowing, but within the context of a diplomatic path still being open, the deterrence effect, we believe, has merit.
I think this means they know their sanctions are crap.
I mean, if
Like, I think
Putin
it means
doesn't
that they
go,
know. I
oh
think,
no, what am I going to do? What, like, if,
like, I
like,
think it means, yeah, I think this means that, like, they know that they're not really going to put real sanctions with teeth and that, like,
right,
so they don't want to say what they are because Putin's going to be like, who cares?
right.
And because they're not willing to, like, do more harm to the economies. So
Yeah,
just admit it. Just admit it. Just be like, I don't care about Ukraine. I mean, I don't know. Like, just admit you don't care. I mean, I don't know. Wouldn't that be like at least more honest? At least, or tone down the rhetoric. Like, don't try to say that you're going to do diplomacy and at the same time be like, Putin is preparing the most violent takeover of Ukraine since of like any leader today, and it's like prepare for like Cambodian killing fields or something. And
right.
like that kind of rhetoric is really acting on oil prices. So like tone it down.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it feels to me like the Biden administration is pounding that they're going to invade, they're going to invade, they're going to invade, and then if they don't invade, they can be like, well, see, look, we threatened them with these sanctions and stuff, and I looked Vladimir in the eye, man, and said, "You're a lion face horse pony soldier," or whatever that quote is from Biden, and got him to back down. But I don't think that's going to work. Either Putin's going to do it, or he's not. And with that kind of speak, I don't. It's kind of hard to argue that he wouldn't because that's not exactly an assurance of bad things to come. So I might have to change my take. I might have to say he's going to invade based on that Vice President Harris quote.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
let's see here. We got a few more stories before Dr. Foreman hops on.
what should we do
Did you want to do the
next?
federal oil lease one, or did you want to skip that one?
No, that was supposed to be skipped.
Okay,
That was
okay.
wrong.
Okay. Arab oil producers say OPEC Plus should stick to current output agreement. This goes back to something we talked about a minute ago, which is pricing. If they're sticking to the current agreement, then they must think that prices or demand and supply will rebalance. Would be my takeaway. No.
Yeah, it's interesting because they managed to get quotes from Saudi, UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq. So you've got all of them giving quotes about like what they think. So you've got ABS from Saudi basically saying that the pandemic and the recovery have taught us the value of caution. caution, a word I know some people hate me for, but I will continue being cautious and mindful of the need to retain flexibility in our strategy and adopt a long-term perspective, aka I'm not changing anything. Then you've got the UAE saying, and the UAE gave a little more information because Mazrui basically said, we're looking at supply and demand, and he blamed geopolitics for oil prices. We are all hoping for the de-escalation. I think our plan has been working. I don't believe that the market is hugely undersupplied currently. It's the other factors that are outside our hands which are impacting the market. So he's basically like, not our fault, guys. Tone it down in the Ukraine, and your oil prices will come down.
Okay, yeah. So that quote I thought was interesting because when he says that, and this is the problem with oil and gas analysis, because when he says that, you're like, okay, when you say, oh gosh, I don't believe that the market is hugely undersupplied currently. So where does he think prices should be? Right. So what is a market where the prices are not hugely undersupplied? Where does that put prices at? Is that down to 83? Is that down to 73? Because you could make an argument that maybe 63 is where it should be if you're saying, well, the demand's a little bit high, but it's not that undersupplied. You see what I'm saying? Like it's not really. It's an interesting quote, but it doesn't really shed light on much. You're muted.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I think that that's intentional because they never like to say where they think oil prices should be. But I do think that he's kind of implying that it should be probably in the low 80s, mid 80s. I mean, because he's admitting that it's a little undersupplied. But he's saying, but then on the other hand, you've got this whole thing where OPEC is like underproducing now by like I think someone said like by like it could be as much as 1,000,000 barrels, like from where because they're supposed to have been adding 400,000 a month, and they're not, and like every month the gap gets wider. So it's not like OPEC isn't participating in this undersupply.
Right.
So if OPEC Plus was actually adding the amount that they are allowed to add, we'd have more oil in the market. So I see his thing about the market being somewhat undersupplied. Just it's not undersupplied to indicate like 96. I don't know. I'm guessing like 80s.
Okay, a few more stories before we get Dr. Foreman on. 3 states with shuttered nuclear plants see emissions rise. CO2 power plants has climbed nearly 15% in New York State, which says, hey, we don't want that kind of cool stuff. Dr. Wald, this is the least surprising headline ever, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Get rid of the
What
clean
happens?
stuff and
What happens when you decommission your nuclear plants? It's like people think that means that solar and wind are going to take up the slack, but no, it's natural gas, coal, oil, all that fun stuff. So someday they're going to figure out how to make energy off of pixie dust and unicorn horns, but today is not that day.
No, today is not that day. Well, but how long you think until this kind of narrative starts to make people re-question some of these policies?
I mean, I think it's like starting a tiny bit, but there's just so much like reaction against nuclear. Like it's still so entrenched that, and like the anti-nuclear people are really well organized. So I think that it's like a known thing, but getting to policy and also money is just a huge hurdle that I'm not sure can be overcome. Except by France, which apparently has like kind of, at least the government is adopting a narrative of let's go nuclear.
Yeah. Okay, let's hear. I got time for one more thing. UN Pact may restrict plastic production. Big oil aims to stop it. Do they though? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure big oil. Yeah, so I found this is hilarious because, okay, so one of the things, at least, and I'm sure we'll talk about this with Dr. Foreman, is the like incredible rise in petrochemical production that are used for plastics in the US and how this is like now like take up a third of our crude oil production. I think he said in the January statistical report. So like US is like producing lots of plastic.
Hmm.
And yet and then we had this pandemic come along and everyone's like masks and gloves and face shields and plexiglass and all this stuff that really isn't permanent and gets thrown away. I mean, I read somewhere like something like 3 billion masks get thrown away a day. Some like insane number. It could be even more than that. I don't even remember exactly. But and so the UN is going to go to Africa and decide, let's all sign a pact that says we're never going to use single-use plastics. First of all, Africa's going to be like, no, sorry, no, we want single-use plastics. And then everyone else is going to be like, oh, yes, we definitely agree. No more plastic straws, no more plastic bags, but yes to, masks and gloves and all of that, and you must wear them all the time. So I don't know, I find it so hypocritical.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the UN probably should figure out how to be effective. At least one thing.
And also not do this stuff in Africa. Like, that's just wrong. It's basically like we all just polluted the planet so much with our single-use things because we were super scared of this virus, but you all don't. You're not going to get to use this stuff. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Not for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I don't think, just from my dealings with the folks in Africa, that they really take that messaging that well either. They're not really interested in hearing about much of that. So I suspect that that's not going to get a lot of traction down there. Let's see here. Do we have one more, Dr. Wall? Do we have one more?
That was it.
Big banks fund new oil.
Oh, the big banks.
Yeah. Big
Forgot
banks.
about the big banks.
Yes, big banks. What's going on?
Yeah, I thought this was interesting. So they're saying that HSBC, Barclays, Deutsche Bank are still backing new oil and gas despite being part of a green banking group. I didn't know there was a green club they could be in. And they're saying investors should force banks to demand green plans from fossil fuel firms before funding them. So we'll fund your oil and gas, but please show us your green plans. That's stupid too. So what I thought was interesting is that like I'm not so surprised by this because like BlackRock, for example, and I may have talked about this before. BlackRock is all like every company that we invest in has to show your net zero by this year, like, or by X year plan, or we're not going to invest in you anymore. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to invest in coal, and we're going to get rid of coal. And then you look at like what they're actually doing, and like they're not actually getting rid of coal. They're still like passively invested in tons of coal companies and making a lot of money off of it. So, it's like we say one thing and we do another. And that's, to me, like that's what these banks, it seems like that's what these banks are doing. They're like pressured to say, no, we're not going to fund this stuff. So they say it, but then in practice, they just do what they want.
Yeah. I do have a question for you. I don't know, I haven't looked at the statewide forecast, but here in Granbury, it's 85 the high today. Okay. The high on Wednesday is 35 with a 50% chance of frozen mix, and on Thursday, an 80% chance of freezing rain. Now, I don't know if this is statewide or not, but I haven't been hearing much talk about the state of Texas shutting down again. Is that because we like survived the first test a few weeks ago and people aren't worried about it, or have you heard outside the state, is that being talked about? Because it's gonna be cold in a lot of places.
There's supposed to be a big. Well, wait. Oh, there was a really funny headline about it. Yes, it was like something like everyone's being involuntarily frozen or something.
Yeah.
It was like, you mean like weather? Like we don't control the weather? Yeah, everybody knows that. It's interesting. I was actually reading something. I have it on my phone. I was reading something earlier today about the Texas freeze.
Mm-hmm.
Hold on, where was this? It was in the Washington Post. It says, a year after Texas cold spell, study shows renewable energy could help prevent blackouts.
Oh, of course.
This made me laugh. Electricity blackouts could be avoided across the nation by switching to solar, wind, and water energy sources. This so-called report argues. So I was reading it. So basically, they're saying, so it's a recent study. Where is this? A study from Stanford. Okay, so some study from Stanford claims that electricity blackouts can be avoided across the nation, perhaps even during intense weather events, by switching to 100% clean and renewable energy such as solar, wind, and water.
Yeah. Well, we have a listener who's giving me a hard time about saying that we say that clean energy advocates don't know what they're talking about. That's why we say it right there, sir. That is why, because they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, Dr. Dean Foreman is waiting in the wings. There he is. Put him up on the big screen.
Hey.
Let's see
Hi.
here. There we go. Start over. Dr. Foreman, how are you doing today, sir?
Doing fantastic. How are y'all? Good to see you.
We're doing good. Doing
Yeah.
good. We are a week late. The monthly statistical report came out last Thursday. We were off last week. I think you were off last week. Everybody took off. Thanks for joining us this President's Day. And
Absolutely.
you were nice enough to send us, we'll link this as well, a blog post that you wrote kind of summarizing this. So we'll be sure to include that in our show notes. So let's start with our monthly statistical report. January, let's see, from 1965, right? So January had the highest amount of demand for other oils. This is intermediate products and refining and petrochemicals, from which products like medical plastics are up since 1965. That's a long time. That's a long time.
Absolutely. And we've just never seen anything quite like this. So it's the highest for the month of January for total U.S. petroleum demand. And the leading product, the thing that's increased the most, is on, frankly, just a tailwind with COVID. So think of every COVID test as a piece of plastic, right? I mean, there's some plastic, medical plastics, packaging, everything that's gone into that just got turbocharged at the end of the year.
So yeah, on something like this, when we look forward to the coming months, you would expect to see that trend to continue, right? Because those things that you mentioned aren't going to go away tomorrow. You wouldn't think.
All right, it's a great question because this debate is the same one we had exactly a year ago. In fact, with many of our member companies, is saying, look, some of this could just normalize, and within a few months, we'd expect it to go back to normal. But yet, here we are, a year again into it, and a lot of the demand for this has been enduring. So, look, investments have been made on this belief that this is going to be something that might endure, and that COVID hasn't exactly normalized after 2 years here. So it has continued. But even if we took that out, and one of the questions that I've gotten offline was, well, aren't other oils subject to revisions historically from EIA? And what about that? How important is it? If we take that completely off, and don't get me wrong, it's 7 million barrels per day at a record high. It's a lot. But even then, if we go all the way back to 2010, this last month would represent the third highest since 2010. So really solid, even if we took out this exceptionally strong petrochemical and refining demand for other oils.
Okay, and then one more question on the distillate economic indicator. Looking at this on page, I think it's 3, just kind of looking back historically at the recession chart that you have that starts in 2008 and ends mid 2009. If for the listeners, it's going down to the right and then up to the right, but before it goes all the way and levels back off, the recession's over. Here, we far exceeded previous years, and according to this chart, we're still in the recession. What gives? How should we interpret that? Because it looks weird from the visual standpoint.
Well, until the National Bureau of Economic Research declares the end of the recession, the gray area on this chart doesn't stop and dictate. Technically, if we've gotten back toward a high point in this, you would expect that there'll be a point at which they say the recession technically is over. But for the meantime, we're reflecting that. The more important thing is that, and for the listeners, this distillate economic indicator takes the supply, demand, trade, and inventories for diesel fuel, in addition to some price information and some interest rate information that gets at carrying costs and costs for investment, basically risk premium, risk on, risk off. Those factors together are a good leading economic indicator of where industrial production and broader economic growth would go. And what this has been saying, and we created it in 2018, so it's been live for 4 years now and back tested all the way back through 2008 and 9. It's been a consistent leading indicator. It's been stable. It's been one of the best leading indicators, actually, of economic growth over the last 4 years. And what we've seen actually is that the industrial production index has, um, i- after peaking in terms of year-on-year growth, it's come down, but the indicators actually leveled off and continue to indicate positive, uh, slowing, but at a diminishing rate kind of growth. So that's what you'd expect. But it's almost like gravity, where it's pulling the industrial production up along with it. And it has been an indicator that the industrial side of the US economy has continued to do quite well. And in fact, it's been saying this for months, but exactly what we're talking about with the refining activity, petrochemical activity on the heels of other oils is consistent with that kind of direction.
Is you mentioned in the report that we're actually we're experiencing a obviously relative dearth of domestic crude oil production.
Yeah.
And how is that expected to impact? I mean, you said it may have eroded the feedstock advantage that a lot of refiners were experiencing. Do you think that that will also impact the petrochemicals? And how should we kind of interpret this and information and into the larger picture?
So let's take the upstream resource development separate from the downstream refining petrochemical considerations here. Just from an upstream standpoint, it's really hard to catch up on investment once you're behind. And in our last quarterly report, we highlighted that about 1 in 3 well completions across the U.S. in 2021 came from drilled but uncompleted wells, and we discussed that during the broadcast last month. But the important thing out of that is that there comes a point where you can't continue to rely on those and you organically need more drilling activity. Now, the good news is that in the first 6 weeks of the year, we saw an average of 6 rigs added every week for the first 6 weeks. That's great, but we're still down if we go to mid-February and compare back to the same point in 2019. And remember that later in 2019, early 2020 is when we spooled up to some of those record levels of domestic crude oil and natural gas production. Well, the oil rigs, the ones that are drilling for oil, according to Baker Hughes, are still down the better part of 40% compared to the same point in 2019. So yes, it's great, and we're seeing the precursors of this supply response coming, but it's going to take a while to catch up. And then we have the question about how strong and resilient the ducts will be and how long those can continue based on EIA's estimates.
I love it when we talk about the ducks. So one of the other aspects that I'm going to go back to do we think that this is going to before things scale up? Do we think that this is going to impact refiners margins enough that it might actually cut back on that they might be compelled to cut back on gasoline and petrochemical production, or is the demand still so strong that it doesn't really matter?
No, and thanks for following up with, I mean, that's the perfect part of it, right? Because in addition to the level of production that we've been talking about, it's affected the relative pricing. So, in simple language, if you're going to have the economic motivation for imports, the prices have to reflect high enough to attract those imports, right? And that's the third takeaway, is that we were a net importer to the tune of 1.6 million barrels per day in January. So what that says is that we've had days where it's just cents on the barrel difference between international and domestic crude oil prices. For the month, it was about a little over $3 per barrel. That is enough to roughly cover the cost of transportation, but nothing more than that. So two things have happened to domestic refiners, and it's showing up in terms of lower capacity utilization rates and lower activity. One is that their feedstock price advantage has been diminished by what we just talked about. The other is that natural gas prices, with having risen to the $4 to $5 per million BTU range from a year and two ago being one half or less than that, that's their operations cost, right? So the main processing fuel for refineries and petchem facilities is natural gas. So you add those together, and yes, they have the best workforce in the world. They have great scale across the Gulf Coast in particular, great logistics, really good operations integrity, very well run. but the price advantage in terms of the operations cost there, and now the feedstock advantage diminished. So that has impacted operations levels. As I mentioned, capacity utilization rate has been kind of flatlining and down in the mid to high 80% range. And as a result of this, the thing that we started seeing in December and reported on was that there was a big drop in refined product exports. So this is curious, right? Because by EIA's estimate, global demand for oil was over 101 million barrels per day in December. So demand is back above 2019 levels, but the the demand for exports from the US of the petroleum products has gone down. It's gone down the better part of 2 million barrels per day. This is troubling, right? And it reflects the fact that the price advantage just simply isn't there compared to other places. So we need to see how the refining sector can respond to this, whether these prices normalize over the longer run, and hopefully with a drilling response that spools up over this year, maybe that could change.
That's a really interesting point, and we should make sure to follow up on how refineries are responding to this, like every month as we go on, because it's clear that this affects all sorts of things, like we're seeing, in terms of the import numbers, the export numbers, cost of cost of gasoline, cost of plastics,
Absolutely.
cost of of basically everything, cost of natural gas. I've been saying for a while that we have this historic dislocation in utility pricing because historically the price, like, per unit of energy goes down in the winter and up in the summer. And since 2020, it's just gone up. We haven't gotten that drop in the winter. And, I think a lot of that is due to what we're seeing with natural gas. And so, what we need to, I think, keeping an eye on this will give us some indication of whether we're going to see relief in utilities as well.
And on the petchem side, just following up on that, I mean, when we start looking at the natural gas liquid component parts that go into petrochemicals, and this is also with propane, a heating fuel that's common across America and internationally, right? So your main NGLs, you got ethane, that's the biggest component of when you extract natural gas liquids from the stream of natural gas. Ethane has been between 30 and 40 cents per gallon. It's up, but it's not up in a way that would make petrochemical firms in the US uncompetitive. So it's still relatively attractive. Propane, though, has gone from, it's basically doubled from being like 60 cents, 40 to 60 cents a gallon up to 100, or excuse me, $1.23 a gallon recently. So with that kind of rise in propane prices, and keep in mind that some US petchem firms and then many internationally rely on propane to make propylene and all the derivatives from that, right? So you have competition where the Asian refiners and petchem firms will use naphtha, liquids-based ways of producing to get to uh, the propylene streams, or you can use propane, or you can use ethane in the US to get to ethylene and its derivatives. So as these play out, there is an advantage on the petchem side, so long as those NGLs being extracted from US natural gas continue to be strong. That is one quiet point that we didn't highlight at the front of this, but NGL extraction was at a record high, some 5.8 million barrels per day in January. So that can help, but keep in mind that the closer you get to things that look and exactly are like oil, with naphtha being a light oil, it's up in price just along with crude oil prices. And historically, that's the linkage you'd expect to see.
That's really interesting. I mean, perhaps it's a little bit better that we're well. I mean, as Ryan pointed out a few minutes ago, his neck of the woods is expecting some really cold temperatures, and I think it's all across the Midwest. But in general, we are, like, at least on the tail end, I guess, of winter, and propane is used in residential heating and things like that. And so as we get to the summer, maybe hopefully that the demand will not be quite as significant, at least residentially. But that's probably a pretty small component of the market, I guess, if we're talking about it.
Well, it is and it isn't, because especially regionally, whether you're doing chicken farming in Pennsylvania or turkey farming in southern Minnesota, propane is the thing that keeps a lot of the poultry alive through the winter. And when you get these cold spells, you absolutely need it. And then we get to summer, and it's everybody's barbecue, right? So,
That's true. That's true. Yep.
and a good part of the world actually relies on propane and other liquid petroleum gases as a cooking fuel, heating fuel.
Oh, yeah.
So when we talk about alleviating energy poverty and making sure that people have access
Hmm.
to clean cooking fuels, propane is vitally important. And it's one of the things that has quietly expanded so much with the US energy revolution, but we don't talk a lot about it, right? It's kind of unheralded. It's important. And it's also in EIA's Winter Fuels outlook that came out in October, one of the things that they suggested along with oil prices that would rise. And I think that's proven so far over the 4 months since that came out. That's been the concern, right? Along with
Yeah.
oil prices, it's been up.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. Yeah. So we'll
Yeah.
definitely be tracking propane as well because it's an interesting indicator, and it's also, to me, it seems like for people who are concerned about utility prices. Yes, propane is more expensive, but it's also, if you choose to heat your home with propane and get your own propane tank installed, you can kind of disconnect, at least in some respects, from the grid in a sense, at least some aspects, like for heating your water and cooking and things like that. So there are advantages.
And electricity, you were noting just before I came on, the shift or the call for more renewable electricity, right? And we need to see what happens in playing out in the competition among these technologies. But right now, electricity prices have been part of broader price inflation. They haven't been immune to everything that we've seen so far this year, especially as the things, coal at a 10-year high, natural gas is up, your wind and solar, the technology, if you can get it, it ends up being relatively more expensive to get the panels, to get the turbines, all of that in this environment. So these things, with a lag, there's still an inflationary cycle that goes with that. And we need to watch, especially from a utility standpoint, they're on fuel adjustment clauses where over time, you're going to see more of this impacted. So consumers, the phrase is a potential boiling frog syndrome, right? Yeah, it's getting a little warmer, and we started the year here at some of the highest oil prices since 2014. We'd have to go back, when we've seen the natural gas prices spike up towards $6 per million BTU. That's really back in pre-shale revolution, back in 2008 kind of frame, right?
Yeah.
So, look, these are historic times, and it's taking time for things to catch up. We're watching the investment. We'll be updating our quarterly report for next month, which will have an investment update. My expectation is that the numbers have improved, but I don't see many of these large multi-billion-dollar capital projects moving forward. And that really is key to the economic growth that comes off of our sector, where,
Yeah.
as you were highlighting, especially mid and downstream, the kinds of investments that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, let's talk about production for just a second here. I'm looking at the numbers that you have from Baker Hughes, which is we have 490 active rigs, which is up, but it's down from 671 of January 2020. A couple things there. One, we had to go to 2019 data, I guess, here before too long because the rig count's going to fall off here going in 2020 pretty soon. So how do we measure that? Because it is up. It probably won't go back to 2020 levels. And then when you look at what appears to be kind of the immediate data, like the hotel data out in Midland, the rooms are cheap. And so it doesn't feel like the drilling's really coming back, at least to put a strain on the local hotel market. So how do we think about those type of numbers? Because it's up, but it's not nearly where it was, and maybe it won't get there. And then the local data seems to indicate that it's not really putting a stress on the economy there at all.
It's an interesting anecdotal observation. I don't know about local conditions. The Permian is your best barometer, though, of the leading edge of this. So
Right.
it's performing better in terms of coming back than every other basin has so far. And keep in mind that the headwinds to investment, there have been workforce issues with COVID that have continued. There have been supply chain issues, whether it's line pipe or valves getting through congested ports, the trucking of those to remote areas where truckers have moved to other industries. These concerns have continued. And then when we look at Bloomberg's tracking of debt across the sector, especially for the independents, my goodness, I mean, through the first 3 quarters of last year, we saw on the balance sheet debt representing mid 50, 50, as high as 56%, depending upon the sector you look at, of the balance sheet. And historically, it's usually about a third. So this says you have to fix the balance sheet a bit before you can invest to grow. And now you pile on all these energy policy issues, and whether it's resistance to infrastructure, proposed higher taxes on the industry, clean energy power plan that would eliminate natural gas, over time in the U.S. And frankly, having put a moratorium on federal leasing on new lands, being told by the courts to reimpose that to start leasing, but then basically stretching it out and slow playing that, where it could be another year before we basically still have a moratorium on drilling in effect. And it, you, we're talking about helping allies in Europe with natural gas at this time, but yet DOE and FERC have not been empowered to approve new LNG export petitions, the environmental permits that would go with these prospective terminals. If we do things right, we can attract investment that would basically double the LNG export capacity by 2030 if we get on it now. But it's not happening because, again, DOE and FERC have kind of slow played this. So it's one thing to make a political grandstand and say, look, I really want to help my allies here and get through this energy crisis and put a unified face on this. But it's different to actually have a Secretary of Energy that historically would not even use the words natural gas. That's childish, right? So if you want a concerted effort where you're really serious about U.S. energy security in a time when you have global geopolitical tensions that frankly are being reflected in some of the prices that we're seeing recently, this is important. And I think we need serious efforts to get cogent energy policy that incentivizes these investments and gets rid of the impediments to growing it.
Yeah, another question I have is just thinking about this, not a prediction, but just we talked about the ducks. You mentioned the ducks earlier.
Yeah.
Well, we had a bunch of ducks. We had huge amounts of drilling. So as the drilling slowly comes back, we might not have as many ducks, on the pond, if you will, moving forward. And so it's going to be kind of a delicate balance because if you're not having this tremendous growth, then I would imagine you're less likely to see ducks because they should be drilling the highest quality wells, the highest margins. You mentioned the debt and all other factors. So we should see less ducks moving forward, I would think.
So a couple of issues here. Mark Finley with the Rice Baker Institute has a really insightful blog out on this recently, and he likens it to a working inventory. If you're growing your operations, you have to have some inventory of wells that if something happens that you can continue to move forward no matter what. And if you think of it from that basis, that sort of makes sense. And that says as I grow my activity level, my inventories actually could increase, right? That would be natural. Now, what you saw during 2020 in the downturn was exactly what you said, people being extremely selective in what they drilled, the best rocks, the best crews and completion crews that they had left on staff. So the productivity estimates rose for everything at that point, but then they dropped off. And if we back out these drilled but uncompleted wells right now, we actually see whether it's the Permian Basin, DJ Niobrara, Bakken, that the productivity levels have actually receded a bit once we control for the contributions that are coming from these drilled but uncompleted wells. So we need to see. I think the number of DUCs, it will continue likely to be drawn down here based on EIA's estimates. So that's what we're seeing. Historically, they've revised where they've brought them down a lot. And as that continues in their estimates for the first part of this year, that seems like the trend that we've been on. Now, if we have this continued reliance on it, there just is a point where we've cut in half in the Permian Basin, for example, the number of DUCs that are available by EIA's estimates. You need more organic drilling activity to support the kind of production growth that EIA and others are expecting here.
Yeah, and then I guess there's two ducks, right? There's kind of the long-term duck that they're not planning on doing anything with anytime soon, and then there's ducks that get classified because they just haven't had time to frack it yet, right? And so those I don't really consider ducks because they just haven't gotten there yet. But there's some that they put on the shelves for a significant amount of time. It's that if you don't have that backlog of inventory building up, then you had another downturn. You kind of have this spot where you can't turn the ducks on. And then you got to ramp up drilling, and we know all these other problems we talked about, whether it's supply chain issues or labor issues, or can't get funding. And so it's an interesting spot to kind of watch what happens with the ducks because we did have a huge amount of ducks, whatever you thought of them, to lean on, and we might not have that again moving forward if we don't get a lot of drilling going. It seems. But I'll give you the final word on that.
We've got a fair amount of them still in inventory. I mean, there's nothing that's fundamentally changed at the beginning of this year that wouldn't keep that continuing.
I think those are the bad ones I've been talking about, though. I think that those are the ones that help the three categories of ducks: ones that aren't really ducks, ones that are ducks, and then the ones that really will never be ducks. So there's a bunch of ducks in the Barnett where I live that are never going to be drilled, never going to be drilled. So those are dead ducks.
Time to do some hunting.
Yeah. Okay. So, Dr. Foreman, it was good to have you on as always. Thank you for hopping on this holiday. Anything else before we get you out of here?
No, just api.org, the Chief Economist section in the upper right from the main page has the blog articles that we're talking about. It has the monthly statistical report, the quarterly analysis. And when we meet and have this discussion next month, we'll have the quarterly presentation updated for a more
Perfect.
broad global and U.S. conversation.
Looking forward to that as always. Thank you so much. And we will link to all of that in the show notes.
Awesome.
See you next month.
Great seeing you both.
All right, Dr. Wald. Yeah, I think that duck thing is...
It's really interesting
because I think there's more ducks, and I think this goes back to one of our early episodes. We had Art Berman on, which I'm not a fan of all the things that he says, but I think he's right on the duck stuff, which is there's a lot of ducks that are out there that were never going to be drilled, never going to be completed, and you have to eventually slough those off the back end of the spreadsheet. They don't count, and so if you didn't complete a duck over the past 2 years now, then you do start to wonder how viable of a duck it really is. And so, so anyways, okay, final thoughts before we get out here today. Where will you be? What else can we cover?
Where will I be? So just a quick update. So last week, I think I was on Bloomberg Law. I had a piece, I don't know if I mentioned it, had to do with a climate lawsuit from Baltimore. Okay. So this week I am on the Hill with 5 ways that Biden could help reduce spiking consumer costs at the pump. So basically look at, Biden administration has thrown around gasoline taxes and SPR releases, and they've tried to send envoys to the Saudis to convince OPEC to do God knows what, but none of that's worked. And so I look at some other ways that they could take action that could potentially reduce oil prices and gasoline prices, both in the short term, but also in the longer term. So check that out.
And I've got like 14 episodes of Inside the War Room, including the one with Dr. Friedman and Ellen Wald that I've got to release. So we'll be releasing a couple episodes this week.
Awesome.
So we'll be back though next week with, what's our guest name?
Russell Gold.
Russell Gold, that's
He's
right.
He's going to come on, former Wall Street Journal reporter, author of the book Superpower, who now writes for Texas Monthly, and we are going to talk about the super interesting race in Texas for the Texas Railroad Commission. So,
I thought about running for the Railroad Commissioner, and I asked someone, would they support me? And they're like, no, you should run for state senate if you run. And so I said, okay. So I thought about state senate. I decided not to run for a lot of reasons. I am glad. The reason he told me not to run for Railroad Commission had nothing to do with the candidates that are running, but I am so glad I'm not tied up in all that right now because, it's a festival. So
yeah, it's hilarious because like tomorrow in Jacksonville, we have a local election to replace a city council seat from a guy who died. And like, the biggest issue, or what should be the biggest issue, is garbage pickup. I'm like trying to find a candidate who has at least acknowledged the fact that there's a huge issue with our like garbage and recycling pickup and pledges to like fix it.
Well, there's some of the candidates are still talking about flare mitigation. It's like we're not drilling that much anymore. I mean, flaring is still going on, but it's not the issue it was back, when Sitten got booted. So, anyways, all right, folks, thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll be back